The float plane set me down on the water at 4:15 in the afternoon, and by the time I got my bag off the dock and found the Western Forest Products truck idling at the top of the ramp, the light was already going flat and gray the way it does on the island in October. The driver didn't introduce himself. He just looked at my bag, looked at me, and put the truck in gear. I didn't mind. I was tired, and I'd been traveling since 6 that morning out of Kamloops, and the kind of conversation you have with a stranger in a truck for 20 minutes is the kind you forget before you're done having it. I watched the town go by through the passenger window instead. Port McNeil is not a big place. A few blocks of storefronts, a Tim Hortons, a fuel depot, and then the road thinning out and the trees coming in close on both sides. And that was it. That was the whole of it. The yard was at the end of a gravel spur that branched off the main road about 2 kilometers past the last streetlight. I remember that detail specifically, the last streetlight, because I looked back at it when the truck turned off the pavement, and it was the kind of thing you file away without knowing why. The gravel was packed hard and the truck didn't slow down much. Through the windshield I could see the yard lights coming up, that particular orange-white of sodium lamps over a work site, and beyond them past the scale shed and the equipment bays and the stacked rows of logs, the tree line. Old-growth cedar up close is not like regular forest. I'd worked interior seasons, fir and pine mostly, and that's a different thing entirely. These trees were wide at the base in a way that stops making sense if you think about it too hard, and they went up past the reach of the yard lights into dark that the lights didn't touch. The yard backed right against them. Not a buffer strip, not a cleared margin, just gravel and then bark, 10 meters of open ground between the bunkhouse and the first trunk. I clocked that distance when the driver pulled up and stopped. Couldn't help it. Scaling work trains you to look at a thing and estimate its dimensions before you've consciously decided to, and 10 meters is not a lot of space. That's my way of saying the bunkhouse felt close to the forest in a way that a number alone doesn't quite capture. The bunkhouse itself was a converted modular unit, the kind you see on remote sites everywhere. 2 steps up to a metal door, particle board walls inside, the particular smell of a space that's been heated and cooled and heated again 100 times with different men sleeping in it. 4 bunks, 2 occupied by gear that wasn't mine, a table bolted to the wall, a propane heater in the corner that ticked when it ran. I took the bunk nearest the door out of habit. You do that when you've slept in enough of these places. Near the door means near the exit, and that's a preference that lives in your body before your brain has anything to say about it. The 1-page orientation document was sitting on the table. Western Forest Products letterhead, a paragraph about PPE requirements, a paragraph about the scale shed access code, a line about reporting to the yard foreman. Owen Weaver, it said, though I'd find out soon enough that Weaver wasn't on site, that he ran things by phone and voicemail from the Port Hardy office, and that was the whole of it. Nothing about the site layout beyond the basics. Nothing about overnight procedures. Nothing that would have meant anything to me then anyway, I suppose. I'd taken the contract because 3 months without work had made the math simple. The regular scaler had broken his wrist getting off a loader step. I heard that from the dispatcher who called me. She said it like it was funny, and maybe it was a little. And I had 2 interior seasons behind me and a current ticket, and I was available, and Western Forest Products needed someone on site inside a week. 6 weeks of steady pay. The float plane ticket came in the email the same afternoon I said yes. Not that I was desperate, exactly. That's not quite the word. But 3 months is long enough that you stop being selective, and this was real work. Work I knew how to do, and the only thing unusual about it was the location, and the fact that they'd sent a float plane ticket instead of a ferry schedule. I figured that was just how they moved people up here. I didn't think much about it. I ate a sandwich I'd brought from the airport, read the orientation sheet twice because there wasn't much else to do, and turned in early. The propane heater was doing its job and the bunk was fine. I've slept in worse. I don't know what time it was when the first sound woke me. Late. The yard had gone quiet, the way work sites go quiet after the last shift. That particular absence of machinery that feels louder than the machinery did. I lay there for a minute trying to place what I'd heard, and I couldn't, so I figured it was nothing and closed my eyes again. Then it came back. Not a sound exactly, or not just one sound. More like a shift in the quality of the quiet. Something in the forest had started up, a low, irregular rhythm, and I lay there listening to it, trying to fit it into a category. Wildlife, maybe. Wind in the upper canopy. Some kind of hydraulic bleed from the equipment bays carrying strange through the dark. I'd worked sites near water before, and sound does odd things when there's a tree line to bounce it off. Then it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. One moment it was there, and the next moment it wasn't, and the silence after it was exactly the same silence as before it. No trailing off. No last echo. Just presence, and then nothing, like someone had put a hand over it. I waited for it to come back. It didn't. I lay there longer than I needed to, which tells you something about how it sat with me, though I couldn't have told you what exactly. I didn't have a framework for it yet. I was a scaler who needed the work, in a yard that looked like every yard I'd worked. And the forest outside was just a forest that made sounds at night the way forests do. That's what I told myself. I rolled over and pulled the blanket up, and eventually I went back to sleep. But I didn't stop listening. That's the thing I remember. Even after I closed my eyes again, some part of me stayed tuned to that frequency, waiting for the sound to come back, or for something else to come instead. It didn't. Not that night. The morning came in gray and damp, which is just how mornings come up there. I'd slept harder than I expected after everything, and when my alarm went at 6, I lay still for a minute, listening to the yard start up. The low diesel grumble of something warming, a hydraulic whine from somewhere across the gravel. Ordinary sounds, the kind that tell you a place is already working without you. I got dressed, ate something out of my bag because I hadn't figured out the cookhouse situation yet, and went out to find whoever I was supposed to report to. Alvin was already at the loader. He was up on the step checking something on the control panel when I crossed the yard, and he didn't look up right away. Just finished what he was doing and climbed down with the unhurried movement of a man who's been doing the same thing long enough that he doesn't need to think about the sequence. 6'2", heavy set, wearing a high-vis vest over canvas so worn it had gone soft at the elbows. Steel gray hair cropped close. He had a face that had been outside for a long time, not weathered in a romantic way, just deeply lined. The skin around his eyes pulled tight from squinting into every kind of light. "Ryan," he said. "Yeah." "Alvin." He didn't offer a hand. He turned back to the loader and nodded at the step. "Come up." That was the whole introduction. I've had longer conversations with vending machines. I climbed up and he started walking me through the controls, and that's when I understood what kind of man I was dealing with. He talked the way the machine worked. No wasted motion, no extra words. This lever does this. This gauge tells you that. You watch this number here, and if it drops below that mark, you stop and you call it in. You don't try to diagnose it yourself. He pointed at things with 2 fingers, flat against the panel, and waited until I'd actually looked at what he was pointing at before he moved on. Some guys give you the tour, and they're really just listening to themselves talk. Alvin was actually teaching. There's a difference, and you feel it pretty quick. I'd run loaders before, not this model, but similar enough, and I told him so. He said, "Good," and adjusted his pace accordingly, skipping past the basics and getting into the site-specific stuff, where the soft ground was, which section of the deck was uneven, how the logs coming off the water tended to run wet and needed an extra pass on the scale before you logged the weight. Practical things Things you don't put in a manual because they're specific to this yard, this water, this ground. We were maybe 40 minutes in when he said the first of the three things. He was showing me the sight lines from the cab, explaining how the blind spots worked when you were moving a full lift, and without changing his tone at all, he said to use the lit path between the bunkhouse and the scale shed when I was moving around the yard after dark. Not the shortcut across the gravel, the lit path, the one that ran along the equipment side. He said it the same way he'd said everything else. Flat, informational, like he was telling me which gauge to watch. I said sure, made sense, didn't think twice about it. The path was there, it was lit. Using it was the obvious choice. I'd worked enough yards to know that nighttime navigation in a working sort is how people get hurt. You step wrong in the dark near a deck, and you're done. So I filed it under common sense from a senior man, and kept my eyes on the controls. The second thing came about 10 minutes later. He'd climbed down by then, and I was in the cab running through the lever sequence while he watched from the ground, and he called up that I should keep my flashlight away from the tree line after dark. He said the beam scattered off the bark and disoriented wildlife. And disoriented wildlife near a working yard was a problem nobody needed. Deer, he said. Maybe bear. He said it in a way that suggested he'd seen it cause problems before, and that was enough for me. I've worked near enough wilderness to know that's actually true, by the way. A flashlight into dense brush at night does strange things. The light fragments, bounces back at weird angles, and animals that would otherwise give you a wide berth will sometimes hold their ground or move toward you because they can't read the source correctly. I'd heard that from a guy on an interior job years back, and it had stuck. So when Alvin said it, it landed in a place where I already had a hook for it, made sense, filed it. The third thing came at the end. We were finishing up. I was climbing down from the cab, and he said to wear earplugs after 10 at night, because the hydraulics echoed off the trees and wrecked a person's sleep. He said he'd learned that the hard way his first week, said it like a man sharing a minor inconvenience he'd already solved. He had a pair in his vest pocket and held them out, the orange foam kind, standard issue, and I took them. "How long have you been here?" I asked. 19 years, he said. I didn't have anything to say to that. 19 years at one yard is a long time. I'd done 2 interior seasons and thought I was getting somewhere. He'd been in this one place longer than I'd been doing the work at all. He walked off toward the equipment shed, and that was that. Orientation done. I stood there for a minute with the earplugs in my hand and looked around the yard. The scale shed across the gravel, the bunkhouse behind me, the tree line at the edge of everything. The cedars were massive up close, the kind of old growth that makes you recalibrate your sense of scale. The lowest branches were higher than the bunkhouse roof. The bark was dark and deeply furrowed, reddish-brown where it caught the morning light. And the trees were close enough together that even in daylight you couldn't see more than 20 or 30 feet into them before the light gave out. I thought about the flashlight thing, how the beam would scatter off bark like that. Made sense. I pocketed the earplugs and went to find the scale shed. The rest of the day was just work. Scaling is repetitive in the way that most field work is repetitive. You develop a rhythm. You move through the sequence. You stop thinking about the individual steps and start thinking about the aggregate. I was measuring, logging, cross-referencing against the loader tallies, getting a feel for the yard's particular patterns. Every sort has them. The way the loads come in, the way the grades run, which operators are precise and which ones you have to double-check. I was building the picture. I ate with a couple of the other workers at the cookhouse, got their names, forgot one of them almost immediately. The usual thing. Nobody mentioned anything unusual about the yard. Nobody mentioned Alvin's rules, which I hadn't thought of as rules yet. They were just advice. Practical advice from a man who'd been there 19 years. That night, I followed the lit path to the scale shed to drop off my tally sheets, walked back the same way, and was in my bunk by 9:30. At 10, I put the earplugs in. The orange foam ones expanded slowly in my ears, and the yard sounds dimmed down to a low, muffled version of themselves. The distant hydraulics, the water, the trees doing whatever trees do at night. I went to sleep. No hesitation, no second thoughts. The rules made sense, and I'd followed them, and that was the whole of it. That's the thing about good instruction. When it's delivered right, you don't question it. You just do it, because the man who told you sounds like he knows, and the reasons he gives you are the kind of reasons that already live in your head as common sense. Alvin had been doing this for 19 years. I'd been doing it for 2 seasons. The math on who to listen to was simple. I didn't know yet that the math was the point, that the simplicity of it was the whole mechanism, that he'd been passing those 3 things off as standard procedure for long enough that they'd become indistinguishable from it, and that I'd accepted them the same way every worker before me probably had, without friction, without a second look, because they arrived inside a lesson about something else entirely. I just put the earplugs in and went to sleep. That night, nothing happened. The head cold came on slow, the way they do. Scratchy throat on the second day. Then by evening, the pressure behind my eyes and that underwater feeling in my ears. Nothing serious. I'd worked through worse. I took 2 ibuprofen from the first aid kit in the scale shed, drank a cup of instant soup from the box someone had left in the bunkhouse cupboard, and figured I'd sleep it off. The earplugs were the problem. They're foam, the standard orange kind, and you roll them down and let them expand inside the canal. When your ears are clear, that's fine. When your ears are swollen and pressurized, and everything already sounds like it's coming through a wall, you push those things in, and it's like someone's pressing thumbs against the sides of your head. I tried twice. First time I got them seated, and lasted maybe 20 minutes before I pulled them out. Second time I didn't even get that far. The pressure built immediately. This dense, uncomfortable thing that wasn't quite pain, but was close enough that I couldn't ignore it. And I dropped them on the nightstand and told myself the hydraulics weren't running overnight anyway. That Alvin had said it was the echo that caused the problem, and there was no echo if there was no equipment running, and that I'd be fine. That's the thing about rationalizing a rule you don't want to follow. You can always find the seam in it if you look. I went to sleep around 10:30. The bunkhouse was warm enough. The cold had made me tired in that heavy, boneless way, and I went under fast. I don't remember dreaming. I woke up at 1 in the morning. I know it was 1 because I looked at my phone immediately, the way you do when something pulls you out of sleep and you're trying to get your bearings. The screen said 1:03. I was lying on my back and I didn't know yet what had woken me. Then I heard it again. My full name, first and last, called from somewhere outside from the direction of the tree line, in a voice I recognized. That's the part that's hard to explain, because the recognition itself was strange. I'd heard Owen Weaver's voice exactly twice, both times on the office phone when I'd called in to confirm the contract details, and gotten his voicemail greeting instead of a person. A standard greeting, professional and flat, the kind a foreman records once and never thinks about again. I hadn't thought about it since. I couldn't have told you before that moment that I'd retained it. But when the voice came through the window, it landed with that specific quality of familiarity, not "I know this voice," as a conscious thought, but the body-level recognition that happens before the thought, the thing where you've already placed it before you've decided to place it. It was asking me to come check a scale reading, calm, reasonable. The kind of request that made sense at 1 in the morning if something had come up on the overnight log, if there was a measurement discrepancy that needed the scaler's eye before the morning sort. I got out of my bunk. I wasn't running. I wasn't alarmed. That's the thing I keep coming back to even now. I was just getting up to go do my job, the way you do when someone in authority asks you to. The request had arrived in the right voice, with the right framing, at a time when a scaler might reasonably be needed. Every part of it fit. I pulled on my canvas pants, didn't bother with a jacket, and crossed to the window. The yard lights were on, the way they stayed on all night. 4 high-sodium floods on poles, throwing that orange-yellow light across the gravel and the equipment bays and the near edge of the log decks. The lit path ran between the bunkhouse and the scale shed, exactly the way Alvin had described it. Beyond the last flood, where the light ran out, the tree line started. There was a figure standing at that edge. It had its back to me. High-visibility vest, the same orange-yellow as the yard lights, the kind every worker on site wore. I couldn't see the face. I couldn't see anything identifying. Just the shape of a person standing at the exact place where the light ended and the dark began, perfectly still, with its back turned. My hand went to the window latch. I don't remember deciding to do that. My hand just went there, the way your hand goes to a door handle when you're about to go through a door. The latch was a simple lever mechanism, the kind on every modular unit I've ever been in. I had my fingers on it. The bunkhouse door opened, not the window. The door behind me, the one that opened from outside. It opened fast, not violent, but with purpose. The kind of opening that means someone who knows where they're going. I turned around. Alvin was in the doorway. He was in his work gear, canvas jacket, boots, like he'd been outside already, or had never gone to bed. His face was the same as it always was, and flat, practical, the expression of a man who has already decided how a situation is going to go before he walks into it. "Step away from the window," he said. "Put the earplugs in." Not a question, not an explanation. Just those 2 things, delivered in the same register he'd used to tell me about the hydraulics and the flashlight, the same register he used for everything. I looked back at the window. The figure at the tree line hadn't moved. Still there, still with its back turned, still exactly at the edge of the light. I stepped back from the window. I don't know how many steps. Enough that the window was no longer directly in front of me, enough that I was in the middle of the bunkhouse floor in my socks and my canvas pants with my hand no longer on anything. The earplugs were on the nightstand where I dropped them. I didn't pick them up yet. I was looking at Alvin. He hadn't come inside. He was still in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and he was watching me the way you watch someone who's standing too close to something they shouldn't be standing close to. Not panicked, but attentive, ready to say something again if he needed to. Outside, through the window I'd stepped away from, the figure at the tree line still hadn't moved. I didn't have a single piece of explanation for any of it. Not for the voice using Owen Weaver's voicemail greeting to call my full name out of the dark. Not for the figure in the vest standing at the exact edge of the light with its back turned. Not for Alvin being outside at 1 a.m, already dressed, crossing the yard at a fast walk like he'd been watching for something. Not for the way the request had made complete sense to me, had felt like a reasonable thing, a work thing, the kind of thing you get up and do, until I was standing in the middle of the room with the cold floor through my socks and the window behind me and Alvin in the doorway looking at me like I'd just stepped back from a ledge. I stood there. Alvin stood there. The figure outside didn't move. That was the whole of it right then. 3 things in a room and a yard and a tree line, and none of them making any sense I could put into words. Alvin hadn't moved from the doorway. He was still looking at me the way he'd looked at me when he came in. Not alarmed, not sympathetic, just watchful, the way you watch a piece of equipment that's been acting up to see if it's going to settle. "What is that?" I said. Not a question exactly, more like I was trying to make the sentence exist in the room so something had to be done with it. Alvin looked at me for a moment. Then he looked past me toward the window, which I'd stepped away from like he'd told me to, and the curtain was still open. and I did not look back at it. "Known hazard," he said. I waited. "Company's insurance doesn't cover it." He said it the same way he'd told me the hydraulic pressure on the loader ran high in cold weather. Flat, informational, like he was reading from a maintenance log. "Best thing you can do is finish the contract, keep the rules, don't make it a problem." That was it. That was the whole answer. I've thought about this a lot since, and I think what actually scared me more than the figure, more than the voice using Owen Weaver's voicemail to say my full name out of the dark, was the shape of what Alvin had just said. Insurance doesn't cover it. That's not a man telling you something is unexplained. That's a man telling you something has been assessed, filed, run through a process. Somebody at Western Forest Products at some point had sat across a desk from an actuary or a legal team or whoever handles that kind of thing, and they had described whatever was out there at the tree line, and the answer that came back was that it fell outside the policy. And then the yard kept running. That was the part I couldn't get past. Not that it existed, that somebody had done the math on it and decided the math worked out fine. Alvin said goodnight and pulled the door shut behind him. I heard his boots on the gravel, steady and unhurried, going back the way he'd come. I didn't sleep. I didn't go back to the window either. I sat on the edge of the bunk with the overhead light on and the curtain closed, and I tried to think of a single thing I could do that would make the situation make sense, and I came up empty every time. After a while, I started moving just to have something to do with my hands, straightened my gear bag, checked my boots were where I'd left them, did a slow circuit of the bunkhouse, the way you do in a small space when you're too wound up to sit still. That's when I found the fire safety box. It was mounted low on the wall beside the exterior door, the kind of thing you stop seeing after the first day. Red metal, white cross, a latch that had probably been stiff since the unit was installed. I'd clocked it on arrival the same way I clock all the safety equipment on a new site, just habit, and then filed it away. I don't know why I opened it. I was moving around the room and I got to that wall and my hand went to the latch. Something to do. That's my way of saying I had no particular reason. Inside, a foil emergency blanket, still in the plastic, a card with the burn treatment protocol, a pair of latex gloves, standard kit, nothing unusual. I lifted the emergency blanket out to check underneath it, which I also can't fully explain. And underneath it was a laminated card, handwritten, sitting flat against the bottom of the box. I picked it up. The handwriting was Alvin's. I didn't know that yet. I didn't know it consciously. Hadn't seen enough of his writing to recognize it. But I knew it was his, the same way you know a voice before you can place it. Something about the way the letters were formed, careful and compressed, the kind of handwriting a man develops when he's used to writing in conditions where there isn't much room or much light, dated in the top right corner, 19 years back. 7 rules, numbered, no title. I read them in order. The first 3 were Alvin's unofficial orientation, almost word for word. The lit path, the flashlight, the earplugs. Seeing them written down like that, in a laminated card hidden under an emergency blanket in a fire safety box, did something to the air in the room. I stood there under the overhead light and I read them again. And they were still the same words he'd said to me on the first morning while he was demonstrating the loader controls. And they were completely different things now. Rule 4. I'm going to say it the way it was written because I've been saying it in my head for long enough that I've got it exact. If you hear your name called from the tree line after the yard lights are on, do not answer and do not go to the window. It has already seen your face. It is using your voice now, not its own. I read that sentence twice. Both times it landed the same way. I thought about the night before. The second night. The one where I'd had the earplugs in, and something had come through muffled and indistinct, a rhythm I'd decided was probably the hydraulic echo, and gone back to sleep. I thought about whether that had been my name. I thought about whether the earplugs had been the only reason I'd been able to decide it wasn't. I kept reading. Rule 5 covered the lit path again, more specific this time. How far onto the path counted as safe. What to do if a light was out. Rule 6. It could not enter a building with its interior lights on. I looked up at the overhead bulb when I read that one. Looked at the lamp on the small table by the bunk. Thought about the window I'd been about to open with my hand on the latch. Rule 7 was the last one. If it takes someone, do not go after them. You will hear that person calling for help in their own voice. It will not be them. I set the card down on the bunk, picked it up again, read Rule 7 one more time. Alvin had written these down 19 years ago. He'd written them down because he'd needed them to exist somewhere outside his own memory. That's the only reason a person makes a document like that. Not to share it, not officially, because if he'd wanted to share it officially, he'd have gone to the foreman or the company or whoever you go to, and clearly that conversation had gone somewhere that ended with, "Insurance doesn't cover it," and the yard staying open. He'd written it down and laminated it, and put it in the fire safety box, because the fire safety box was the one place on a work site that every overnight worker would eventually open, and he'd needed someone else to have the rules in case he wasn't there to pass them on. I thought about the first morning. The loader controls, the flat practical voice, the 3 instructions that had sounded exactly like common sense. He'd been doing it for 19 years. Every new hire, same delivery, casual, matter-of-fact, folded into the machinery orientation so it went down smooth, standard procedure, the kind of thing a senior man passes to a new hire. I'd accepted it without a single question because it had been packaged to be accepted without a single question, and I'd thought that was Alvin being efficient, and it was, but not in the way I'd understood. He'd kept me safe for 2 nights by making the rules sound boring. And on the 3rd night, I'd left the earplugs out because of a head cold, and I'd gone to the window. And the thing at the tree line had been standing there with its back turned, and I'd had my hand on the latch. Rule 4 said it was using my voice now. I sat down on the bunk. The laminated card was in my hands. The overhead light was on. Outside, somewhere past the curtain and the yard lights and the place where the illumination ended, the tree line was doing whatever it did when nobody was watching it, and I did not know if the figure was still there, and I was not going to open the curtain to find out. I read all 7 rules again from the top. Then I put the card back in the fire safety box, under the emergency blanket, where Alvin had left it. I don't know why I put it back. Force of habit, maybe. You find something in a safety kit, you leave it in the safety kit. Or maybe I just needed it to stay where it was, in the place Alvin had decided it should be, because Alvin had earned the decision, and I hadn't. I left every light in the bunkhouse on. I sat on the bunk and I did not sleep, and I did not go near the window. And outside the yard was quiet, in the way it got quiet sometimes. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that had decided, for now, to wait. The 4th night I kept every light on. Not just the overhead, the reading lamp above the bunk, the bathroom fluorescent, the little utility strip above the kitchenette that I'd never even used. Every socket with a bulb in it. Rule 6 said it couldn't enter a building with its interior lights on, and I wasn't going to test the edges of that. I wasn't going to sit in a corner with one lamp and wonder if one lamp was enough. I turned on everything, and I sat on the bunk, and I waited for 11 o'clock. Alvin did his equipment check every night at 11. I'd watched him do it the first 3 nights. A slow circuit of the equipment bay, a look at the loader, a hand on the shed door to make sure it was latched. Took him maybe 15 minutes. Then he'd cross the yard and give the bunkhouse a knock, 2 short ones, and I'd hear his boots on the gravel going back to wherever he slept. I didn't know where he slept, actually. I'd never asked. The modular unit had 4 rooms, and I'd assumed one of them was his, but I'd never seen him come or go from any of them, and that was the kind of thing I hadn't thought to think about until now. 11 o'clock came. I know it came because I was watching the clock on the microwave, the green digits, the colon blinking between the hours and the minutes. 11 o'clock came and went, and the yard outside the curtained window stayed quiet, and Alvin did not knock. I gave it 20 minutes. Told myself he was running late. Told myself equipment checks don't always run on schedule. Told myself a lot of things. The overhead light hummed. The bathroom fluorescent had a flicker in it I hadn't noticed before. A half-second stutter every few minutes. And every time it did it, my eyes went straight to it. By 11:30, I'd stopped telling myself things. I wasn't moving, though. That's the part I keep coming back to when I think about that night. I wasn't moving. I was just sitting on the bunk with my work boots on and my jacket on, fully dressed because I'd never actually gotten undressed for bed, and I was watching the microwave clock and not moving. There's a thing that happens when you're scared enough that it gets past the shaking hand stage and into something quieter. You go still. I went still. midnight. The voice came from somewhere between the scale shed and the equipment bay. Out in the dark, in that gap between the 2 buildings where the yard lights didn't quite reach. My own voice, which I'm going to tell you is a strange thing to describe because I don't hear my own voice the way other people do. You never do. You hear it through bone and tissue, and it always sounds different on a recording. But this was not that. This was my voice, the way other people hear it, from outside, which meant whatever was using it had pulled it from somewhere I didn't have access to myself. It said I was outside the shed and couldn't get the door open and needed someone to come. The pull of it was immediate. That's the only word for it. Pull. Like something physical. Like the feeling when you're standing at a height and your body wants to step forward before your brain has weighed in. I was off the bunk before I'd decided anything. My hand was on the door frame, the interior door, the bunkhouse door, and I was standing there with the cold metal of the latch under my fingers, and the yard outside the door, and the dark between the buildings where my own voice had just been. I stood there. I don't know how long. Long enough that my hand went cold on the latch. Long enough that the bathroom fluorescent stuttered twice. What stopped me was not instinct. I want to be clear about that because instinct would have sent me out the door. Instinct was what had gotten me to the door in the first place. What stopped me was a sentence. Alvin's handwriting, cramped and careful, the pen pressing hard like he'd wanted it to stay. Rule 7. If it takes someone, do not go after them. You will hear that person calling for help in their own voice. It will not be them. I had memorized that sentence the night before. Not because I'd planned to, not because I'd sat there drilling it. I'd read it and it had stayed, the way certain things stay when the person who wrote them clearly paid for the knowledge. Alvin had paid for it. 19 years ago, he'd sat somewhere in this yard or one like it, and he'd written those 7 rules down, and then he'd laminated the card and put it in the fire safety box, and spent the next 19 years passing the important parts off as standard procedure, quietly, to every new hire who came through. He'd pass them to me on the first morning with his hand on the loader controls and his voice completely flat. The sentence stopped me. Not me, the sentence. That's an important distinction, and I don't know how else to make it. I let go of the latch. I stood in the middle of the bunkhouse for a moment with my hands at my sides and my own voice still doing something out there in the dark between the buildings, the words cycling, the request repeating, and I turned my back on the door and I crossed to the foreman's office. The foreman's office was a partition section at the end of the modular unit. A desk and a filing cabinet and a wall-mounted VHF radio bolted at eye level, the kind of fixed marine unit that doesn't go anywhere and doesn't need to because it's always supposed to be right there, I turned on every light in the room. Desk lamp, overhead, the fluorescent strip above the filing cabinet. Then I sat down in front of the radio. The GPS coordinates for the yard were on a laminated sheet taped to the wall beside the radio. Someone had thought to put them there, whoever had set up the office. And I had one clear thought about that person. Whoever they were, they'd understood that in an emergency, you don't always have time to look things up. I keyed channel 16. My voice, my actual voice, went out across Broughton Strait. I gave the yard's coordinates. I gave Alvin's name, his full name, Alvin Marquez, senior equipment operator. I said a worker was missing during overnight shift, and gave the time. I said it all once, and then I said it all again, because that's what you do. You say it twice so whoever's listening knows it wasn't static. Then I let go of the key and sat there. The radio hissed. Out in the yard, between the scale shed and the equipment bay, my voice had gone quiet. I don't know when exactly, sometime while I was crossing to the office, or while I was reading the coordinates off the laminated sheet, or while I was keying the mic. It had stopped, and I hadn't noticed it stop, which was almost worse than hearing it. I understood, sitting there with my hand still resting on the radio, what I'd just done. Silence had been the thing keeping this contained. Alvin had kept it contained for 19 years. The card in the fire safety box, the rules dressed up as company policy, the whole quiet architecture of it. Western Forest Products knew, or knew enough, and had decided the knowing was manageable as long as it stayed internal. As long as nobody made it a matter of record. I'd just made it a matter of record. Alvin's name, the yard's coordinates, a missing worker, broadcast on channel 16 across open water at midnight. Somebody had heard it. Somebody was going to respond. I sat in the foreman's office with every light burning, and I did not touch the radio again, and I did not go near the window, and I waited for whatever came next. He came out of the trees maybe 20 minutes after I made the broadcast. Could have been longer. Time had stopped working properly somewhere around when I heard my own voice out in the dark, and it hadn't fixed itself yet. I was sitting at the desk with both hands flat on the surface, not doing anything in particular with them. Just keeping them visible, I think. The office had 4 lights. The overhead fluorescent, a desk lamp, a work light clamped to the shelf above the radio, and a small emergency strip mounted near the floor that I'd found by pulling open every cabinet in the room until I found the one with a power switch. All 4 were on. Rule 6. I wasn't taking chances with Rule 6. I saw him because the yard lights caught him first. He stepped out of the cedars at the same point where the figure had stood 2 nights earlier, that exact edge where the illumination ended, and the dark began. Except this time he was walking toward the yard, not standing still. And he was walking in a straight line toward the bunkhouse, not using the lit path, not following the gravel that curved around the equipment shed the way it was supposed to. Just a direct line across open ground, the way you'd walk if you'd forgotten the path existed, or if the path had never mattered to you. I recognized the vest. Orange high-vis, the Western Forest Products logo on the back. I recognized the build, the way he moved. It was Alvin's walk. That slightly forward lean he had, like he was always heading into a headwind that wasn't there. My hands pressed harder against the desk surface. He crossed the yard and stopped at the bunkhouse door. Just stopped. Stood there with his back to me, facing the bunkhouse door, and didn't move. Didn't knock. Didn't reach for the handle. Just stood there the way the figure had stood 2 nights ago. And I thought about Rule 4, about how it used a voice that wasn't its own. And I thought about the card in the fire safety box and Alvin's handwriting, 19 years of it, and I did not move from the chair. I don't know how long he stood there. Long enough that I started counting my own breaths and lost track somewhere in the 40s. Then he turned around. He turned and looked directly at the foreman's office window. Directly at me. The yard lights were at an angle that put his face in partial shadow, but not enough shadow. I could see his face. I could see him looking at the window, which meant he could see me through it, which meant he knew exactly where I was and had probably known the whole time. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed. He looked at the window for what felt like a long time. Then he turned back toward the forest, unhurried, no change in pace, and walked the same straight line back the way he'd come. He didn't use the lit path going back either. He just walked toward the tree line, and the tree line took him, the cedars closing around him the way they do. No sound, no branch movement that I could see from where I was sitting. Just a man walking into dark, and then no man. I sat there with my hands on the desk, and I didn't hear anything after that. Not my voice, not Alvin's voice, not whatever it used when it called Owen Weaver's voicemail greeting out of the dark 2 nights ago. Nothing. The yard was quiet in the way the forest had been quiet on that first night. Not a fading kind of quiet, not the trailing off of something that was there a moment ago, but an immediate total absence, like a switch, presence, and then nothing. I'd noticed that on the first night and hadn't known what to make of it. I knew now, or I knew enough, which isn't the same thing, but was going to have to do. I stayed in the chair. That's the part that's hardest to explain to somebody who wasn't there. Not the figure at the tree line, not the voice in the dark, using my own voice back at me, not even Alvin walking out of the cedars and looking directly at the office window. The hardest part is explaining why I stayed in the chair after all of that, why I didn't go after him, because the pull of it, I want to be honest about this, the pull of going outside was still there, even after everything, even knowing what I knew. The thought that it might actually be Alvin, that he might be confused or hurt or in some state I could help with, that thought didn't go away just because Rule 7 existed. Rule 7 existed because Alvin had needed to write it down. He'd needed to put it somewhere outside his own head, because he understood that in the moment, when you were standing at the door with your hand on the frame, and you could hear someone calling for help in a voice you recognized, your own reasoning wasn't going to be enough. He'd written it down 19 years ago because he'd probably stood where I was standing and felt exactly what I was feeling, and understood that the only thing that would hold was a rule made in advance, made cold, made before the moment arrived. I stayed in the chair because Alvin had written the rule down and I had memorized it. That's the whole of it. The night went on. I don't have a better way to describe it than that. It went on the way nights do when you're not sleeping and not doing anything in particular, just sitting in a lit room waiting for something to happen that doesn't happen. I watched the window. I watched the yard. The yard stayed empty. The tree line stayed still. At some point around 3 a.m, I got up and checked every light again, touching each switch to confirm it was on, which I understood was not a rational thing to do, but did anyway. The fluorescent, the desk lamp, the work light, the emergency strip, all on. I sat back down. I thought about the broadcast, about Alvin's name going out across Broughton Strait at midnight on Channel 16, which is the distress and calling channel, which means if there's a vessel in range with a working radio and someone awake, they hear it. The Coast Guard monitors it. Vessels monitor it. I'd given the GPS coordinates off the laminated sheet on the wall. I'd given a description of a missing worker during overnight shift. I'd said it twice, clearly, in a flat voice, because my voice had gone flat somewhere between crossing the bunkhouse floor and sitting down at the radio, and it had stayed that way. Western Forest Products had kept this contained for 19 years. That's what I kept coming back to while I sat in that chair. 19 years of Alvin passing the rules off as company policy. 19 years of one-page orientation documents that said nothing unusual. 19 years of insurance language and incident reports that found other explanations for whatever needed explaining. Somebody at that company knew. Somebody had made the calculation that the knowing was manageable as long as it stayed inside the fence line. That was finished now. I'd made it a matter of record at midnight, and somebody had heard it, and somebody was going to respond, and the calculation was broken. I'd understood that when I keyed the mic, and I understood it now, and I understood it was the right thing, and I also understood that Alvin had spent 19 years not doing it, which meant Alvin had reasons I wasn't in a position to fully evaluate, and that was a thought I kept picking up and putting back down, all the way through to morning. Morning came in the way it does that far north in the shoulder season, slow and gray, the light arriving without conviction, the yard materializing out of the dark piece by piece. The equipment shed first, then the scale shed, then the gravel path and the log decks and the edge of the tree line, which looked like a tree line, and nothing else in the flat morning light. I was still in the chair. Every light was still on. I was alive, which had not felt like a certainty somewhere around 2 in the morning, but which turned out to be true. I didn't go outside. I didn't go after him. I sat there in the lit office and I waited, and the night finished and I was still in the chair when the light came up, and that was all I could say for myself. And it was enough. It had to be enough. It was the only thing I had. The float plane came in at 7. I heard it before I saw it. That particular engine pitch that drops as it comes off the water. The way the sound changes when the hull makes contact and the whole thing settles. I was still in the foreman's office. Every light still on. I had not moved from that chair in a way that counted as moving. Just shifted and straightened and shifted again through the small hours while the yard outside stayed quiet and gray, and the tree line stayed exactly where it had always been. When the plane taxied to the dock, I watched through the window. 3 people came off it, safety vests, hard hats, clipboards. One of them walked faster than the others. She had her clipboard up before she was fully across the gravel, auburn hair pulled back, moving like someone who had already decided what the next 4 steps were before she'd taken the first one. She came straight to the foreman's office, opened the door without knocking, and looked at me the way a person looks at something they need to assess quickly and move on from. "Bill Ryan," she said. Not a question. "Yeah." "Clementine Pierce, Western Forest Product Safety." She was already scanning the room. Lights, radio, the empty coffee mug, me. "You made the Channel 16 call last night." "I did." She wrote something on the clipboard. "Anyone else on site?" I told her Alvin Marquez had not come in for his 11 o'clock check and that I had not seen him since the night before. I said it in the order it happened. She wrote while I talked and did not ask me to slow down or repeat myself, which I appreciated. When I finished, she looked at the radio and then at me. "Okay," she said. "I need you to come with me." That was more or less the end of my time at the yard. Not the end of it in my head. That's a different thing, and it's still going. But the end of me being physically present in that place. Clementine walked me to the float plane in the way that safety coordinators walk people they're evacuating, which is close enough to guide without being close enough to support. Like they want to be ready if you need it, but don't want to assume. I had my bag. I'd packed it in the foreman's office sometime around 5 in the morning when I'd run out of other things to do with my hands. I didn't look back at the tree line when we crossed the yard. I want to say that was a deliberate choice, some kind of discipline, but the truth is I just didn't. I looked at the gravel in front of me, and then I looked at the plane, and then I got on it. Port McNeil from the air is a small place. You can see how small from a float plane in a way you can't from the road. The grid of it, the water on 3 sides, the forest pressing in from the 4th. We landed at the harbor, and Clementine walked me to a company truck, and drove me to a motel on the main strip that Western Forest Products apparently kept a standing account with, which told me something about how often this kind of thing happened. I didn't ask her what kind of thing she thought this was. Axel Simpson showed up at the motel at 10 that morning. WorkSafe BC badge, wire-framed glasses, a collared shirt that looked like it had been ironed that day, which seemed like a lot of effort for a drive out to Port McNeil. He had a form. He had several forms, actually, in a folder, and he laid them on the small table by the window with the efficiency of a man who had done this before, and had found that having the forms visible from the start made people more cooperative. He was thorough. I'll give him that. He asked me about the timeline, about Alvin's last known location, about the radio call, about my physical and mental state during the overnight hours. He used the phrase psychological distress event twice before he got to the part where he needed me to write something down, and by the second time I understood he wasn't describing what had happened. He was offering me the language the form required. The form had a box, not a large box. Maybe 4 lines, the kind of space you'd use to describe a near miss with a forklift or a slip on a wet deck. I sat with the pen for a while. Axel waited. He was good at waiting. He had the glasses and the neat hair and the folder, and he sat across from me like a man who understood that the process required pauses and had made his peace with them. I wrote psychological distress event resulting from unexpected isolation during overnight shift. I wrote that I had been unable to locate a coworker and had made a precautionary radio call. I wrote that I was requesting the full review period. Then I signed it and pushed it back across the table, and Axel collected it without reading it in front of me, which was a courtesy I noticed. He placed me on medical leave pending an 11-week incident review. He said it in the language of forms: pending review, return to work assessment, access to EAP resources if required. He gave me a card with a phone number on it. I put it in my pocket. Alvin Marquez was listed as missing. I know that because Axel told me, in the same measured voice he used for everything else, that a separate search and rescue file had been opened and that I might be contacted for follow-up. He said, missing, the way people say it when they mean something else, but can't put the something else in a form either. I stayed in the motel for 2 nights. I didn't have anywhere particular to be. The contract was terminated, obviously, and the interior season wouldn't start for another month, and 3 months of no work before this. One meant my options were limited. On the second morning, I drove back down island to my apartment in Nanaimo, and I sat in it, and I thought about Alvin for a long time. Not the thing at the tree line wearing his face. The actual Alvin. The way he'd explained the loader controls with his hands. The flat patience of it. The way he'd handed me those 3 instructions on the first morning like they were nothing, and expected me to treat them like nothing. 19 years of that. 19 years of knowing what was out there, and coming back every season and passing the rules to the new hire, and watching to make sure they followed them. I don't know if that's bravery or something else. I'm not sure bravery is the right word for a thing you do quietly and without telling anyone why. I heard about the yard reopening from a guy I knew who ran equipment for a subcontractor out of Campbell River. He'd heard it from someone else. A new overnight crew, 6 days after I'd been pulled out. Frank Alvarado running the site. The story going around was that a worker had gone missing in the forest, which happened sometimes up there, and that the crew should report unusual sounds near the tree line to Frank directly. That last part stopped me when I heard it. Report to Frank directly. Not to safety, not to WorkSafe BC, not to anyone with a form or a process or a Channel 16 radio. To Frank. Which meant Frank knew, or knew enough, and had decided that the way to manage it was to keep it moving through the same channel it had always moved through. One man, knowing, telling the next crew just enough to keep them functional and not enough to make them leave. I thought about writing something down. Not for WorkSafe BC. That ship had sailed, and Axel's form had made clear what the available language was. Something else. I thought about it the way you think about something you know you're going to do eventually, that you keep putting off because you haven't figured out the shape of it yet. Alvin had written his card 19 years ago, laminated it, tucked it under the emergency blankets where a person would only find it if they were looking for something else, or looking for anything at all, because they were scared enough to search. He hadn't put his name on it, just the date and the rules. Like he understood that the name didn't matter. What mattered was that the information existed somewhere outside his own head, where it could survive him. It did survive him, that's the thing. Whatever happened to Alvin out there in the trees, the card was still in the fire safety box, and I had read it, and Rule 7 was still in my memory where I had put it deliberately, because the handwriting told me it had been earned. He wrote it down and it kept me inside. I don't know what to do with that. I've been sitting with it for 11 weeks now, which is how long the review took, and I still don't have a clean answer. The review came back as incident closed, contributing factors under ongoing assessment, which is the WorkSafe BC way of saying they found nothing they could put in a box either. I'm off leave now. I've got a scaling contract starting in 3 weeks, interior work, a yard I've been to before with people I know. I'm going to take it because that's the work, and I know how to do it. But I keep thinking about that blank line on Axel's form. The 4 lines they gave me to describe what happened at the yard, what I saw, what Alvin was to me, and what the tree line took. What it felt like to hear my own voice coming out of the dark, asking for help. 4 lines. I sat there with the pen, and I understood exactly what Alvin had understood 19 years earlier. That you write it down because you need it to exist outside your own head, and that the place you write it has to be big enough to hold it. WorkSafe BC doesn't print a form that size. I'm not sure anyone does.